We got Tommy Ashley here, covers North Carolina for Inside Carolina 24/7 Sports Network. Huge game for this for both teams and for different reasons. Tommy, just we're going to get into Miami stuff, but how big is this game for North Carolina from a North Carolina standpoint, coming in 5-0?
Yeah, I mean, Chris, appreciate you having me. Of course, it's always a pleasure to talk football with you. This game's giant for North Carolina, for the North Carolina program, and for Mac Brown. Mac Brown obviously came back for a second go round. This is year five. They've had some hiccups along the way. They had potential to have a really special season last year, and it sort of fell off the rails after being 9-1. Now they sit here 5-0 with everything in front of them. You're starting to get national buzz. Obviously, Drake May has been in the Heisman talk for 2 years now. He's having that same type season, but nobody's really giving him that credit yet this year. But Miami coming to town, a ranked game in Kenan Stadium. A lot of people are referencing 1997. It was Judgment Night then when Florida State, it was a top five matchup then when Florida State came in, and Florida State sort of manhandled the Tar Heels in that game early and often. But for North Carolina, I called it earlier in the week. It's a stair step game, right? If you want to keep walking up the steps to the promised land in college football, which is college football playoff and national recognition, then these are the type games you want to play in. And for North Carolina, it's huge to win it. You want to play in them, yes, but if you play in them and never win them, then you're just always an afterthought. And I think for Saturday night at 7:30, North Carolina's got a chance to um, stake their claim on the national landscape. And that's what Mac Brown's talked about doing. That's what North Carolina needs to do. And that's certainly what the North Carolina fan base is just simply dying for Carolina to do.
Yeah, and again, 2-0 right now in the conference, and again, no divisions, and just kind of keeping pace. Louisville and Florida State out to 3-0 starts, and it's certainly at the top. It's going to be interesting to see how these teams kind of get up there. And I thought that's why it was such a big loss for Miami, dropping 4-0 start. Everything looked great, dropping that game to Georgia Tech, and I think there's a lot to talk about with how it ended, but I just thought, the other flip side, which is not being talked about that much, and maybe I have not talked about it enough, it's just how well they did not play in that game against Georgia Tech. Certainly they should have won. Obviously, we know about the kneel down stuff, but they just didn't play well. And I think to lose a game like that, to not play well against an opponent like Georgia Tech, certainly puts a lot of pressure on Miami moving forward. 0-1 the conference, so certainly they can still, if they do beat North Carolina and stop that 4-game losing streak, they could get right back into this thing. But I think we're all just kind of wondering what it's going to look like for Miami after what happened. Are the players going to come out and play? And certainly all the coaches and players are saying all the right things, but we'll see when it gets out there. It's a road game against a team they've lost the last four against, a team they've not played well against in the first half, giving up 26 a game, trailed in all four of those losses at halftime. So Miami has an opportunity. I think it's big. I think I hate to say this, but I really think it's a pivotal point for Mario Cristobal in his coaching career at Miami. Whether it's this game, the next one against Clemson, if you drop both of these games 0-3, and then what are we doing here after a 5-7 season a year ago? And I say this a lot with all these coaches that come in at Miami. At some point, you got to win games. Kind of what you were saying, Tommy. You've got to win these big ones. You've got to win games. You can't come up short all the time. So I think it's a lot of pressure for Miami to win this and kind of put Georgia Tech more in the rear view. It's going to be hard to erase everything that happened. You can't do that overnight, but they've got to move on. They've got to find a way to win this one. There's no doubt.
Yeah, you make a great point, and that's what people lose. I mean, you see a game that ends crazily. It was Atlanta Braves the other night against Philadelphia, Miami and Georgia Tech. I mean, games turn at the end, and people forget what happened all during them. And to your point, Miami did not look good against Georgia Tech. Van Dyke had the three interceptions. One similarity that's going to be in this game is there was some weather down there. There's probably going to be some weather here in in North Carolina in Chapel Hill on Saturday night. But for me, watching the game, and this is where you kind of have to sort of balance out your expectations. Carolina destroyed Syracuse. I mean, in every facet, complete domination. Miami struggled. Maybe North Carolina's on a high that, because it was so easy against Syracuse. Maybe if Miami leaks that game out against Georgia Tech, they say, oh, we can still play that way. We can still screw it up in every way and still win. So maybe the mindset of correcting things is not there. It's an interesting dynamic. To your point, since there are no divisions in the ACC, and Louisville has a sweetheart schedule where they don't play anybody in the ACC, you can't lose a second one and have a chance at the ACC championship game. So it's huge for North Carolina, but you're right, it's equally huge for Miami, for Mario Cristobal.
Yeah, and the ACC schedule is interesting. I said before the year I like Duke's team. I didn't like Duke's schedule. To their point, and they're navigating it. It's kind of on the same point, Tommy, of what Miami was going into Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech was coming off a loss to Bowling Green. You can say whatever that you're going to take this team seriously, but how can you take a team like that seriously with how they played, how poorly they played against Bowling Green in that loss, and the switching of the coordinators, and Miami's coming off the bye, and then it just didn't work out. So yeah, sports has a way of kind of bringing you back down. We see it in the NFL. We saw it kind of locally here with the Dolphins, how well they played there with scoring 70 and coming back down. I think too, Tommy, to your point, and kind of with this, the line might not be as high as what you would think. If you're into the Vegas odds and the lines right there, maybe you would expect with how it went there. So we'll see. And again, it's just big for Miami. They got to find a way to get into it. Tommy, with North Carolina, what we deal with this a lot with Miami, essentially how over the years of trying to get back to successful seasons, kind of playing this underdog role, counting us out type thing. How do you think North Carolina has played? The spotlight has been on North Carolina. They keep going up the rankings. I'm looking at this matchup. Miami's only faced North Carolina twice since they've been ranked in the top 25 in those meetings. How do you think they've handled or kind of navigated? They've played a tough schedule, comparatively non-conference with all those games there, but just kind of being, the target or Drake May. He's not sneaking up on anybody, that's for sure, but just North Carolina in general.
Yeah, I mean, over the past, and this has been an issue for North Carolina, they haven't handled success very well. And they had a high ranking in 20, I think it was 20, they went 6-7. And Sam Howell didn't have a great year. They lost at Florida State that year. They had no business losing at Florida State. They've lost to Georgia Tech a couple times when they shouldn't have, when they're sort of feeling themselves a little bit. Last year they were 9-1. People were talking about Heisman and all this and playoffs, and then they lose to Georgia Tech. So handling success has been an issue for North Carolina. And to your point, they haven't had a ton of success. They've been 5-0 like 4 times in history of the team. In 1997 being the last time, I think they were 8-0 before they lost to Florida State in that season. So a lot of expectations are building in Chapel Hill, and Mac Brown talks about it. He talks about the ability of North Carolina to deal with success. And one thing that, Chris, if I'm being honest, this year feels a little different because against Syracuse, that was a type game where if they don't handle their success well, what happens against Syracuse? Because I think Syracuse is a decent football team. And they, like I mentioned before, they tore Syracuse up. So they're getting better at it, but Miami is another step. And Miami is a different animal altogether. Vastly talented team on both sides of the ball. How Drake May. I don't think success affects Drake May. I think Drake May is different. We can talk about him. He's just a different type player. He's been around national championships in his own home. He's got a brother that's got one. He's got an older brother that's got one with Florida. So he understands success and staying on an even keel. But how do you play when you hear all the news clippings and all I'm dating myself, all the Twitter and the Instagram and the social stuff? And that'll be key for North Carolina. Mac Brown's done a good job keeping a lid on that stuff. They've been very businesslike. Miami needs to get back too. And Miami has not been able to reach the level they've been over, over the years. But North Carolina, this is new waters for them. They tasted it last year. I think they're building on it this year. But it still remains to be seen. I can promise you this: there's plenty of North Carolina fans that are wondering what could possibly happen next, and that's just the nature of it.
Yeah, and I know you believe in the stair-stepping type of progress that teams have to make, and maybe that's what we're seeing in North Carolina. They went through it last year, as you mentioned, that it didn't go their way when things got going. That 9-1 there, and then the way it finished. And Miami's got they've got a step. They got a few stairs to step to with where they're at. But I know Miami fans. I know people are feeling like if Miami brings their best, offensively and defensively, and really that 4-0 start, the way I was kind of analyzing is they were pretty good in all, the four major areas, run defense, pass defense, run offense, pass offense. Everything was just kind of clicking. And I know the opponents, some of the conference stuff, but Miami overwhelmed them, other than Texas A&M and that different conference, but they ran away from them after being down early. Before we get into the Drake May stuff, because that's certainly a huge talking point, Tommy, defensively for North Carolina. And I know we spoke in the offseason about some numbers from a year ago, but what are you seeing with this defense? And certainly that'll be a big factor in this one, and obviously for North Carolina moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, North Carolina's defense has been significantly better, and I'm not a huge stat guy, but you can see it on the field. Just the ability of them to create pressure, create havoc for quarterbacks. But when you add a guy like Elijah Huzzy from East Tennessee State, who's just a ball hawk back there, it allows you to do a lot of things on the back end in coverage that makes your defensive line look a little bit better than they did a year before when they had none of that. They didn't have any pressure, so the guys on the back end had to cover for multiple times or multiple seconds. It felt like minutes at times during that. But you've got Elijah Huzzy back there. You've got Tayon Holloway. You've got Marcus Allen, another cornerback that nobody talks about because nobody throws at. It allows that defensive front to make some noise. And Kamen Rucker has just been a superstar for North Carolina this year. You're a year older. You're 2 years in the system. You've played to the standard that they preach about, and you've been pretty mistake free on the back end and on all three levels. And so I just think it's a maturity thing, and guys are healthy. A lot of guys were banged up last year. It's the nature of college football or football in general. You play through injuries and all, but it helps when you've got a 310-pound Miles Murphy in the middle, and he's healthy. He can do things that he couldn't do last year because he was battling ankle injuries. I just think it's interesting to watch. Credit Gene Chizik. He got hammered in the offseason. North Carolina was as bad as you could be on defense last year, but he stayed the course, and they do. He often talked, and he would answer my questions saying, I'm doing what I think we can do best. It's not what we might not be the best, but I'm doing what we think we can do the best. And now he has a multiple options. He's got some depth. The defensive line, the guys are averaging like 40 snaps a game, whereas last year they were averaging 60 plus. That's a big difference, Chris. And when those guys don't get tired, so I just think it's a group effort. But it's year two, and they've consistently played well. It started with South Carolina. The sacks are down, but we know there's a lot more to affecting the quarterback than getting them on the ground. If you got somebody under your feet, you got somebody in your face all the time, even if it's not a sack, that's a big deal. And I think that's what North Carolina's done well.